former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter being raided by the FBI today. So this news came out that Scott Ritter was raided. We do have some video of the raid that happened at his house today. He lives just outside of Albany, New York. Let's go ahead and look at the raid. Here they are, the FBI. They went to his house. Nobody really knew what was going on. They just saw that the FBI was raiding his house. And Scott Ritter was nowhere to be found in these images or in this video of the raid, but FBI agents were swarming. A little bit later on, and there were some reports of it. Times Union reported on it. New York Post reported on it. Here's the New York Post. And this is their story. They said that the FBI raided the home of ex-UN inspector Scott Ritter. And really confusing as to what was going on and why. We do know, however, that about a month or so ago, Scott Ritter was trying to fly to Russia for a convention, and he was stopped at the airport, and his passport was seized. So he was unable to get on the plane to Russia. We talked to him about that. That happened maybe a month or 2 months ago. So that is what we know. We know that his passport was taken. He, at that point, when he came on the show to talk about it, said he didn't know anything. They just took it, and they didn't really say anything to him about why. They didn't give him any information. They just basically said, you're not allowed to leave the country by seizing his passport, which seemed quite unconstitutional. If you're not going to charge somebody, if a judge is not going to say, look, you cannot leave the country, so we're taking your passport, it seems really unconstitutional that that authorities at the airport could just suddenly seize your passport without giving you any reason, without charging you with a crime. So they then, but we don't know. We don't know everything. Scott could be remaining quite mum on things, and maybe his attorney is telling him to stay mum, or maybe he just wants to stay mum. But there could have been more to that story. That is just what we knew. Then we see that his house is being raided today. Well, then Scott did come out and he actually made a statement about it. This is what he had to say.
Search warrant at my residence. The search warrant is related to concerns apparently the U.S. government has about violations of the Foreign Agent Registration Act. I will tell you right now, I am not in violation of the Foreign Agent Registration Act. I have not done anything that would do it, and hopefully by executing the search warrant and taking the materials that they did, they will rapidly reach that conclusion. I will say that things like this have a chilling effect on free speech. There's no doubt that I'm being targeted because of statements I've made about U.S. policy in Ukraine. I'm being targeted because I have made an effort to try and improve relations between the United States and Russia, to try to bring about arms control, to bring about peace. Apparently somebody in the U.S. government takes umbrage at this, so they executed a search warrant. The FBI was extraordinarily professional. I have no complaints against the personnel that did this. I do have complaints against the personnel that caused this to happen. This has a chilling impact on free speech. The idea that you have a free speech right in America, when you execute it in a manner that the U.S. government takes exception to, and they launch a search warrant, that is an intimidation factor. I can say that I am not intimidated, and I will continue to speak out, and I will continue to do what I do, because that's my responsibility as an American citizen, and I will continue to operate in that manner. So I think I gave you all the answers you need at this point in time. I would request that you respect that and let me and my wife get on with our business.
What time did they show up today?
I don't know. They were here a long time. So,
Can you say generally what type of stuff was in the boxes they took?
The search warrant allowed them to look for electronic equipment. They were clearly interested in communications that I've had with people related to the work I do. That's all I can say about it. It's up to them to review it. I have nothing to hide. I was cooperative with them, and it is what it is, and we'll get on with it. But as I said, I respect their right to do what they did. I'm not in violation of the law, and I will not be intimidated. So anybody upstairs who thought that this will intimidate me and cause me to stop speaking out, they guessed wrong. Have a great day.
Did they take the passport from you a couple weeks ago?
They took that. That's an old story, but yeah, my passport was seized when I returned from Russia back in June, when I was getting ready to leave for Russia back in June.
You ready?
When you say they took stuff that was related to your work, what work exactly?
I'm a writer. You figure it out. You're a journalist? Imagine if they did a search warrant in your workplace. What would they take? 2 + 2 = 4.
So he's a journalist. He's doing writing. He's also speaking out. He has a podcast. He's also a regular contributor onto Sputnik, which is a radio station. And they've now gone after him for under the FARA Act, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. That act says that if you are in a position, you're working on behalf of a foreign country, you're being paid by a foreign country, and you are looking to influence public opinion, public policy, government policy, any of those types of things, then you need to register with the government as a foreign agent. The people who work for Sputnik and for RT have to register under this because the government says that, well, Russia funds these media outlets, and so they're giving them their marching orders on what to say, and it's influencing public opinion, and so therefore they have to register under the FARA Act. What's interesting, though, about the FARA Act is that it's not consistent. It's used as a tool to go after anybody they want to just silence. It doesn't really matter if the country, when you look at the history of the FARA Act and who they've gone after, it doesn't really matter if the country they're working for is a friendly country, an allied country, or an adversary. That doesn't really have an effect on whether or not you're going to be charged under the FARA Act. Now, when it comes to journalism, as it stands right now, those who work for RT, those who work for Sputnik, those who work for Chinese media, they have to register under the FARA Act, even if they're given total freedom, journalistic freedom, which many of them at RT and Sputnik are. But it doesn't matter if they're still paid. Essentially, the money comes from the government. Some part of it comes from the Russian or Chinese government, so they have to register. But then you ask, okay, well, if you have to register if you're working for Russia or China, what if you work for the BBC? What if you work for a British or Australian news or German news? And the answer to that is no. If you're working as a journalist for those outlets, you don't have to register under the FARA Act because they're not adversarial countries, is what they'll say. Then you say, well, what about Al Jazeera? Because that's funded by the Qatar government. By the Qatari government. So if that is, and are they an ally? Are they a foreign adversary? And that ends up being one that gets debated a lot, is whether or not people who work for Al Jazeera would have to register. Now, remember, all countries are foreign countries. And we really shouldn't kind of look at any other country as an ally specifically, because that could change at any minute. A country could one minute be our ally and the next minute be our adversary. Look at Germany for an example. You can work for the German media and it's okay in the United States today. You do not have to register under the FARA Act. But the last big war we were in, World War II, was against Germany. So of course things can change. And allies can become adversaries, and adversaries can become allies. And that is why this act is particularly nefarious. It's nefarious because it's just up to whoever is sitting in the Justice Department, whether or not they want to go after somebody and for why. Now, I just gave you examples of what you would say, well, those are adversaries. Russia and China are adversaries. Now, we're not at war with either of them. We're not supposed to be at war with either of them. There's been no declared war, not that they've declared war since World War II. But there's been no declared war against either of these countries. And I don't know if it would be exactly fair to say China is an adversary. They're not funding, they're not at war with anybody. They're not funding an adversary in a war that we're engaged in. They're friendly with everybody. And that's a problem for the US government. They don't like that China goes around and says, we're going to stay out of it and we're going to try to have diplomatic relations with all of you. And they've maintained their diplomatic relationship with Russia, of course, with the United States, with Israel, with the Palestinians, with the Arabs, they kind of have that relationship with everybody because they're just in it for business. So the question then is, and what we've also seen recently, just the most recent person who's been charged under the FARA Act was a woman who was charged for potentially spying on behalf of South Korea, which is an ally. We have American bases in South Korea. You've got Paul Manafort, for example, who went to jail for failing to register under the FARA Act for working on behalf of Ukraine, also another ally. So you've got all these allies and people are being charged under that, but then you have these but again, it's kind of it's up to the people sitting in the Justice Department, who they want to go after, why they want to go after those people, what it is their motivation. And really, because it's so flimsy and they could kind of charge anybody for any reason, it could be weaponized. It could be easily weaponized. And that's what Scott Ritter is alleging. He's alleging that his speaking up on behalf of Russia, trying to help Americans see the Russian perspective so that we can make a decision for ourselves whether or not the government is doing the right thing, rather than just blindly trusting our government and just saying, well, the government said, and so that's what I got to think. It's good for us to hear the other side. It's good for us to hear, especially if we're going to be sending men and women off to war, if we're going to be funding wars, if we're going to be piling up dead bodies. It's good for us to at least hear what the other side is thinking and why they feel the need to go to war, what their side of the story is, because maybe we could diplomatically work it out. That is exactly what diplomacy is. So Scott is alleging that because, as a journalist who's been making the rounds on various different outlets, having his own show, writing, being a regular contributor for Sputnik, he's alleging that as a journalist, they're coming after him for speaking a narrative that they do not like. However, it could be that because he is a regular contributor to Sputnik, maybe that is, they're saying you have to register under the FARA Act. Maybe there's something else there. He has taken trips to Russia recently that, one could question, well, who funded those trips? Who was, who coordinated the trips? I mean, there's a lot of questions there, but I think whether or not he actually, one could say, okay, well, maybe he did. Maybe the Russian government, let's just say the Russian government did plan his trips. Maybe they did pay for his trips. Maybe they are funding Sputnik and journalists are operating on Sputnik and on RT and they have journalistic freedom. Maybe all of that is happening. The question is then, what does that does that matter? Should they have to register under the FARA Act as journalists, even if a foreign government is paying it? And that's a question that I think could be debated, whether or not, and if they are going to be needing to register, then why not everybody? Why not people who are also working for the BBC, people working for German media, people working for Israeli media? Why not everybody? It should be an easy standard and a consistent standard to make and maintain, but they don't want to do it that way because they want to be able to weaponize it. So they keep it vague and you just don't know who they're going to go after. One thing to note, the FARA Act resulted in, when it was implemented, I believe in the 60s is when they started it. Since the 60s up until about 2016, there were only 6 people charged or at least convicted under the FARA Act. They rarely actually went after anybody under the FARA Act. Since especially 2016, since Donald Trump became president of the United States, they started weaponizing it quite a bit. And there have been now a number of people who've been charged under the FARA Act. And that is not just those who are working. And you'll notice that the people that were charged under the FARA Act for activities regarding Ukraine, it was when Donald Trump was president. It's when they were going after those people, when he was being impeached for calling up Zelensky and asking him to, look into certain things or whatever. That is when they ramped up the FARA Act for those who are working on behalf of Ukraine. Now, if you're working on behalf of Ukraine today, do you think that they would actually use the FARA Act? Do you think they would utilize it and go after people? So this is just a tool to weaponize. This is not an actual law. They're being consistent. You break the law, you pay the price. This is a weapon that the government is using, and they're just picking and choosing when they want to utilize that weapon and against who. And that is something that we should be vocally against. We should say, look, we need to have a consistent standard for the FARA Act. I do think that the FARA Act is needed. I don't think it's needed for journalists at all. I think it should be eliminated for any and all journalists. I don't care who they're paid for. Who they're paid by. I don't care if they're paid by China, Russia, Israel, Ukraine, the BBC, the British, the Australians. I don't care who they're paid by. Journalists should be left alone from the FARA Act. It's when you get into influencing policy. So when you are lobbying the government, you are lobbying government officials, then I think we could say, all right, look, if you're going to lobby the government, if you're going to pressure for certain policies, if you're going to be a super PAC in this country and you're engaging in political activities, direct political activities, and you are being paid by a foreign government, you need to register under the FARA Act. That's my viewpoint on this. Love to hear from you. Kim at KimIverson.com. Tell me, who do you think should have to register under the FARA Act? Should it be used at all against journalists? When you look at Scott Ritter, you're thinking, okay, well then who did he lobby? I mean, here he is sitting with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Scott lives just outside of Albany. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been in Albany. Here's the picture. He's been in Albany in court. We've been covering his court case where the Democrats are trying to rip him off the New York ballot. The two of them met up. My hope after seeing this image last night was thinking, I hope Scott Ritter is talking some sense into Bobby about Palestine and Israel and what is going on over there. Maybe he was able to, maybe he wasn't. There's a lot of policies that RFK Jr. has that I absolutely agree with. I just really differ with him on this one big policy that I feel like he's way too early influenced on. Many people feel that way. But seeing this image, this is not lobbying a politician. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has not been elected to office. And so this could not be considered Scott Ritter lobbying a politician on behalf of a foreign government. Scott Ritter is a journalist. That is who he is. That is what he's been doing. And he's now being persecuted by the government for being a prominent voice who's been speaking out on behalf of Russia, trying to help. And look, like I said, even if he is being paid, if you're a journalist, if you're just a speaker, I don't think there's anything that needs to be registered there. It's really when you're really trying to influence policy, you're lobbying politicians, you're funding their campaigns, you're meeting with politicians in order to influence policy. That is when that act should be implemented. And I think we should all be speaking out against it and protecting journalists from things like the FARA Act, from things like the Espionage Act. Hey guys, this was just a clip of a longer show. Catch the full show by going to KimIversonShow.com. It is free. It airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. You could go back now and watch this full interview. I highly recommend it. Again, go to KimIversonShow.com. Thank you so much for watching.